Hello everyone and welcome to our third video lecture already. I hope everyone's doing well. So far we've had a little introduction to what theater and performance are. We've talked about theater spaces and audiences, and today we're going to talk about theatrical genres. In other words, what should we know if we're going to read or see a play, or a musical, or an opera, or whatever the performance might be. So I'm specifically talking about formal theater here. You might be asking yourself, why do we need to know this? Okay, let me explain my thought process. We started out the course by talking in broad terms about my concept of what performance happens to be, and that performance is always occurring all around us. And that's why we can relate what occurs around us to formal theater performance. Then we talked about the relationship of theater spaces and where performance occurs to audiences. How do we receive it? Now we're going to talk about genres. What are the things that we're seeing? What are the categories that they fit into? I'm laying a foundation prior to us talking about who are the people who create theater and what theater history have we experienced, and the three plays that we're going to read. If we're going to read three plays, we should have a little bit of an understanding about genres. If we're going to attempt to understand the work that actors, directors, producers, and designers do, we need to have a little bit of an idea regarding how they interpret the work that they create. It's important, in my perspective, as audience, as receivers, that we each have a little bit of knowledge when we're going to watch a performance. So that's why we're talking about theatrical genres now. That's why we need to understand what we should know prior to reading a play or seeing a play. So let's dive right in. First of all, the word genre, I'm sure you have heard going all the way back to middle school English. Genre is just a fancy word that means type or category. And we could apply that not just to theater and not just to novels or poetry that we read, but we can apply it, of course, to music. Think about it. There's different types of music. There's country music, there's hip hop, there's rap, there's classical, there is classic rock, there's grunge rock, there's alternative. Just with music, all different genres of music. So genre applies to a lot of different things. It's referring to the type or category. Another way to think about it is maybe you like to cook and you enjoy cooking in the kitchen. And so you go to the grocery store to buy groceries and you're going to, let's say you're going to make an Italian meal. And so you're going to buy pasta. If you think about it, there's a variety of genres of pasta. There are different types. There are different categories, from spaghetti to macaroni to linguine to fusilini. You name it, there's probably a type of pasta. So, genre, type or category. Now, in terms of theater, if we go back to the 5th century BCE, in this class, I will use BCE to mean before Common Era and CE to reference Common Era. I know academically there are some academics who use BC and AD and they use different terms. I'm going to stick to BCE and CE. Just know that from the start. So let's go to the 5th century BCE. Going back to Greece. At this point in time, there were two two types of drama. And remember, I told you in our very first lecture, the word drama means to do or to act. And the two types of drama, the two genres, were tragedy and comedy. And this is based partly upon the two symbolic masks that performers wear. And so as you look at this photo, this image I found online, the image on the left would be comedy, and the image on the right would be tragedy. Now, here's what you need to kind of sink into your mind a little bit. Going back to the ancient Greece or Roman theater, but primarily we're talking about ancient Greek theater here, right now. I showed you in our second lecture photos I took of a Roman theater at the Ostia ruins. And I said in that lecture that these photos represent also the type of theater that you would have had in Greece, in the ancient Greek theater. Performances occurred during the day because they had to be performed when there was sunlight. So, one thing you need to know is that they took what occurred in the performances very literally. Because the performances had to occur during the day when there was sunlight, the scripts were always written so that the action occurred during the day. It didn't occur at night. Because that idea I talked about in the second lecture about suspension of disbelief, that idea did not exist at this point in time. The audience could not watch a performance in a Greek amphitheater at 3 o'clock in the afternoon that the action was supposed to be occurring at 10 o'clock at night. It's sunlight out. It's full on sun. That didn't happen. So, that's one thing to keep in mind. They just took things very literally. Second thing is that the performances, if you go back to our very first lecture, originated out of dance, ritualistic dance. And so, what happened was you had always a chorus of performers who were dancing and singing. And eventually, around 5th century BCE, the very first performer stepped away from the chorus and spoke to the audience as a character. Well, and then eventually plays were written for 2 characters, and then eventually a play was written for 3 characters, and then a few more characters. Well, because you had this large chorus, only a few people could step out and actually speak to the audience, but also, especially in ancient Greece, the performers were typically all male, even if they were female roles, in order to assist the audience in understanding what was occurring, because you might have one performer who was playing more than one role. That was very, very common. Or you had a performer, a male performer, playing a female role, so a different gender. They used masks, and a different mask for each character. Thus originated tragedy and comedy masks. And depending upon whether the character was tragic overall or comedic overall, was the type of mask they wore. Okay? So, that's where these two genres originate. Viewpoint then becomes how we look at people and events from a very specific, defined perspective. It's a conscious act on the part of who's ever creating the art. Okay, here's what I mean by that. The person who is writing the script writes the script or the text in such a way to address their specific viewpoint or perspective regarding an issue. The first play we're reading for class is Antigone by Sophocles. And when we get to read that play and discuss it, I want you to recognize that Sophocles, as a playwright, is expressing a very specific, I would say, controversial, I would say mind-blowing, I would say millennia before his time concept or viewpoint about the role of women in society in a positive way. But he was going completely against the grain of what the society was that he lived in at that time. That's my perspective. I love the play Antigone. I really, really do. I really like what it says about women, and we're going to talk about that at length when we get to it. But I want you to think about that. That is a great example, and we're reading it for class, of a playwright's viewpoint being shared with the audience. It was Sophocles' conscious act as he created that. And a director takes a viewpoint as well. Performers take a viewpoint. All the people creating the art, they have a viewpoint. It's the director's job to bring all of that together cohesively. So, let's start. We're going to talk about tragedy and comedy in this lecture. Let's start by talking about tragedy. A tragedy would be a dramatic form of serious actions that have universal significance and impart important moral or philosophical implications. All right, let's break this apart. Tragedy is a dramatic form. Dramatic means to do or to act. So it's to do or to act of one, serious actions. Two, these actions represent universal significance. And three, they have important moral and four, philosophical implications. Okay, that's a tragedy. I don't think I need to define for you serious actions. All of you are brilliant enough to know what I mean by serious actions. Let's talk about universal significance. The concept behind universal significance is that regardless of what culture you are from, and if we define culture whether by ethnicity or by race or by gender or by philosophy or by religion, however you want to define cultural differences, there is a universal significance that transcends all of those cultures. Meaning that either morally or philosophically, this idea or action ultimately means the same thing or has the same impact. Let me give you an example. Okay. One significant or very, very important tenet of Confucianism that is very much of Chinese and Korean and other Southeast Asian cultures is the concept of filial piety. And that term is very, very specific to Confucianism. And it has to do with the reverence and respect and honor that a child is expected to give to their parents and then to their grandparents, etc. Okay? That concept, filial piety, is very, very ingrained in Confucianism and then in Neo-Confucianism and in Asian culture, all Asian cultures. In Western culture, and we are a part of Western culture, European Western culture, that term filial piety is not really used. However, Western cultures have been significantly influenced by Middle Eastern culture, and specifically by Middle Eastern culture, I'm referring to Jewish and Islamic cultures, in which they have the tenet of honoring thy father and thy mother. Okay? Trying to be as generic here as possible. So, filial piety is very much spelled out in Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism for Asian cultures. Western cultures have this concept of honoring thy father and thy mother. Okay? I think you know what I'm talking about with that phrase. I hope you do. At the very least, honoring your parents. Different terminologies, different vocabulary, different origins, but universally significantly the same. Okay, so I hope that's an idea there about universal significance. And in terms of important moral and philosophical implications, what I want you to understand is that for this course, and in general, I used to teach philosophy. You should know this. And so I consider morals, ethics, and philosophy to be three separate and distinct concepts and ideas, with philosophical being the most general, ethical and moral each being more specific. Ethical, for this course, if I'm talking about ethics, I want you to think in terms of societal laws and rules. And if I talk morals, I want you to think in terms of cultural mores. Okay? Let's keep that separate. That's tragedy. Now, by general convention, tragedy can be defined or divided into two separate eras. We have the traditional era, which is everything pre-1850. And we have the modern era, which is essentially everything post-1850. Oh, I see I omitted a parentheses right here. Sorry about that. There should be a parentheses right here. So traditional tragedy would be pre-1850. That includes our ancient Greeks and Romans theater. That includes Shakespeare. That includes Marlowe, everything from that period of time. So the Renaissance, all the way up to the Romantic period, which starts about 1850. Okay. Modern is everything 1850 moving forward. So that's what we're talking about: the Romantic era, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Postmodernism, all the isms, which we will get to at the end of the course. Okay? Now, another thing I want you to keep in mind here is that when I'm talking about traditional and modern tragedy, I'm specifically here talking about Western theater. I'm not including African, South American, or Asian theater. Okay? So this traditional and this modern tragedy and this time frame is specifically related to theater that comes out of Greece and Rome, moves up through Europe, and then eventually to North America. Okay? So, a traditional tragedy. This is theater written and conceived prior to 1850. Has essentially 6 characteristics we should keep in mind. Number 1, they usually have a tragic hero or heroine, which would be an extraordinary person that the main action involves or happens to be about. In the play Antigone, can you guess who our tragic hero slash heroine might be? I hope you detect sarcasm. Of course, it's Antigone. She's a tragic heroine. Okay, so there's an extraordinary person. Tragic circumstances are the situations involving that central character, that tragic hero or heroine. So they go through things that are perhaps beyond belief. There is a point of tragic irretrievability, which means the tragic hero or heroine, given their tragic circumstances and the actions that follow, eventually reach a point where they can no longer turn back. Their only option is to continue moving forward. There is a point of acceptance of responsibility in which the hero or the heroine completely accepts responsibility for their actions and willingly sacrifices themselves for what they consider to be the greater good. The play is written in tragic verse. Yes, it's written in verse. There's no way around that. Doesn't mean that it rhymes. It means that there are beats to it, to each line. The greatest way to think about this is, of course, Shakespeare. Now, when we read Antigone, although originally written in verse, I've given you, I think, a really, really, really good adaptation, interpretation of the original verse. And so it should be relatively easy to read. And ultimately, the traditional tragedy has what's referred to as a tragic effect, meaning that by the end, as a receiver, there is either a sense of pessimism or a sense of affirmation that we as receivers experience. Okay? So these 6 components make up the traditional tragedy. Here's a photo of Sir Laurence Olivier in the iconic role of Hamlet that he played and directed in the early 20th century, for which he won the Oscar. And he also performed it on stage many times. Now, modern tragedy. Modern tragedy is what I'm talking about from 1850 to today. So starting mid to late 19th century. With modern tragedy, the central characters were typically not royalty. So, when I talk about these tragic heroes or heroines, oftentimes they are royalty. They are from a royal or ruling family, or of the aristocracy. Okay? When we look at modern tragedy, we are talking about central characters. If you want to use the term hero, heroine, okay. But they are not royalty, they are not from the ruling family. They are generally not of the aristocracy. I'm not saying they could not be. I'm just saying that's the general case. The dialogue is not written in verse, it's written in prose. Now, the challenge isn't to determine whether or not a play fits a traditional definition of a tragedy or a modern definition of a tragedy. The challenge is to discern what effect the play produces in the theater and how successful it is to standing up to criticism in terms of thinking about how that material will last. That becomes the real challenge of a tragedy because plays are written, but the ones that we know and define and give this homage to by saying this is a tragic play is because it stood up to the test of time. Now, this photograph is from Tennessee Williams' play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof that I directed for the University of Nebraska of Omaha back in 2012. So it's been quite a bit of time. So I directed that play. Very much a modern tragedy. Now, we would probably describe the family in that play to be upper middle class to upper class. So that whole idea of generally not being aristocracy hits a little bump in the road with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. They aren't a ruling family, but they are a family that has a significant amount of land and therefore a significant amount of money. So they're not middle class, they're definitely upper middle class to maybe lower upper class. Okay. So now let's talk about some tragedy subgenres. Okay, so traditional tragedy typically falls into the subgenre of either being heroic or romantic. Antigone would be an example of a heroic traditional tragedy. Romeo and Juliet would be an example of a romantic traditional tragedy. Keep in mind here, and this is important for you as you start to think about your discussion response. All of Shakespeare is traditional. Whether we're talking his tragedies, his histories, or his comedy plays. Okay? All of it is traditional. And it's either heroic or romantic. Modern tragic subgenres could be heroic, could be romantic, could be bourgeois, or could be melodrama. So, let's define these four terms. A heroic tragedy, whether it's traditional or modern, has some type of hero figure. Usually it's written in verse because we do not find that we have a lot of heroic modern tragedies. We just don't. There's usually a happy ending or an assumption of an optimistic worldview. Not always. As you think about Greek plays, for example, the heroic traditional tragedies did not always have a happy ending, but they tried to end in such a way to give a better perspective about the world. So that's where we get this assumption of an optimistic worldview. Now, many Asian plays are what could be defined as a heroic tragedy if we apply this Western terminology to Asian plays. Okay? Electra by Sophocles, now we're reading Antigone by Sophocles. Electra by Sophocles is very much an example of a heroic traditional tragedy. All right, so let's talk about Electra for a little bit. Okay, so Electra. This is a play summary I found at ancientliterature.com. So Electra by Sophocles. It's based upon Greek mythology. It's classical literature. So in our introduction, Electra is a tragedy by the ancient Greek playwright Sophocles, probably dating from quite late in his career, so around 410 BCE or later. It is based on the story of Electra and her brother Orestes and the vengeance they take on their mother Clytemnestra and stepfather Aegisthus for the murder of their father Agamemnon in the aftermath of the Trojan War. And it is considered one of Sophocles' most successful dramas. Okay, so Electra and her brother Orestes come together and they enact vengeance on mom and stepdad because mom and stepdad killed dad. That's the basics. That's our intro. Okay, so we have the dramatis personae. In other words, the characters. We have Orestes, Electra, Chrysothemis. Chrysothemis is a sister of Orestes and Electra. We have Orestes' attendant. We have Clytemnestra. We have Aegisthus. We have a chorus of women. We have mute persons. We have Pylades, who is a friend of Orestes. We have Clytemnestra's handmaid. We have two attendants of Orestes. So, in this play, we have Orestes, Electra, Chrysothemis, Clytemnestra, and Aegisthus. So we have 5 characters. Orestes' attendant, Pylades, the handmaid, and the 2 attendants, these other 5 characters, were probably all played by either one of the first 5 who weren't on stage but switched their masks, or maybe 1 or 2 other people. Then we have a chorus of women. It's a chorus of women, but technically at the time that the play was written, probably played by men. And mute persons, probably individuals from within the chorus. So, background. King Agamemnon of what we would call Argos, or Mycenae, returned from the Trojan War with his new concubine Cassandra. His wife, Clytemnestra, had borne a grudge against Agamemnon for many years, since he had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia at the start of the Trojan War in order to placate the gods, and who had in the meantime taken Agamemnon's ambitious cousin Aegisthus as a lover. Killed both Agamemnon and Cassandra. Okay. Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, husband and wife. 4 kids. Their kids are Electra, Iphigenia, Chrysothemis, and Orestes. Iphigenia is sacrificed at the beginning of the Trojan War because Agamemnon thought that's what the gods wanted. That would make them happy. He would therefore be successful. And then he's off to war. In the meantime, his wife, Clytemnestra, gets busy with Aegisthus, who happens to be Agamemnon's cousin. And I presume you know what I mean by gets busy. Agamemnon, while at war, takes a concubine, Cassandra. Keep in mind, at this point in time, the whole idea of having a main wife and concubines was accepted. Okay. Orestes is the infant son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. He sent abroad for his safety, while his sister Electra remained behind, as did their younger sister Chrysothemis. Keep in mind their sister Iphigenia has been sacrificed. Okay. Now Electra remained behind. She's essentially been reduced to being a servant. Chrysothemis did not protest or look for vengeance against their mother. That's all before the play starts. As the play starts, Agamemnon and Cassandra are already dead. So the play begins years after their death. And that infant son, Orestes, is now grown to be a man. And he arrives back in Mycenae, or Argos, whichever term you want to use, in secret with his friend Pylades. They create a plan to get entrance to Clytemnestra's palace by announcing Orestes was dead. And that the two men are actually delivering the remains of Orestes in an urn. Okay, so keep in mind, Clytemnestra and her lover continued to rule after they killed Agamemnon. And a fear that they would have had would be that Orestes would come back as a man, as a young man, because he would have, as the son of Agamemnon, the legitimate right to the throne. Okay? Now, Electra has never come to terms with her father's murder and laments his death. She argues with Chrysothemis over the fact that Chrysothemis placates their father's killers. And Electra's only hope is that one day Orestes is going to come back to avenge their dad. So we eventually get news of Orestes' death. Electra's devastated. Clytemnestra's relieved. Chrysothemis mentions that she's seen some offerings and a lock of hair at Agamemnon's tomb, and she concludes that Orestes has returned. So these three things are all occurring at once, separately. She tells Electra about it. Electra dismisses it. She firmly believes their brother's dead. Electra suggests it's now up to them to kill their hated stepfather. Okay. Later on, Orestes arrives at the palace, carrying the urn, supposedly of his own ashes. Of course he doesn't recognize his sister Electra at first, nor she him. He left when he was a baby. Belatedly realizing who she is, Orestes reveals his identity to his sister, who almost betrays because she's so excited that he's alive. Now, with Electra involved in their plan, Orestes and Pylades enter the house. They kill his mother, Clytemnestra, while Electra is keeping lookout for Aegisthus. They hide her corpse under a sheet, presenting it to Aegisthus when he returns home, claiming it to be the body of Orestes. And you're probably thinking, wait a minute, what about these whole ashes? Aegisthus wasn't home at the time that news came about this urn of ashes to Clytemnestra. Okay? When Aegisthus lifts the veil to discover his dead wife, Orestes reveals himself, and the play ends as Aegisthus is escorted off to be killed at the hearth, which is the same place where Agamemnon was slain. Okay? That is the play, Electra. So, we very much have this heroic figure. And happy ending because our hero and heroine spent years seeking vengeance against those who had killed their father. Whether or not you want to say that's a happy ending, I don't. That's up to you. For Orestes and Electra, it is. For Chrysothemis, she probably doesn't care. All right, now the romantic, traditional, or modern tragedy celebrates the spirit of hope, personal freedom, natural instincts, and the hero might die at the end. Okay? So in the heroic, there's generally this happy ending. In the romantic, it's not always a happy ending. Romeo and Juliet, okay? It's a romantic traditional tragedy. There's no way that's a happy ending. No way. Our hero and our heroine are both dead. Well, another example of a modern, so Electra was an example of a traditional heroic. An example of a modern romantic tragedy is St. Joan by George Bernard Shaw. GBS, George Bernard Shaw. So I went to Shmoop. I like Shmoop. I don't know if you guys have ever used Shmoop, but Shmoop I think is kind of fun. Okay, so I went to shmoop.com. And let me tell you a little bit about St. Joan by George Bernard Shaw. So the St. Joan summary. Joan is this teenage country girl who shows up at the castle of Vaucouleurs, and she's determined to kick the English out of France and to crown the Dauphin, Charles, as king. Okay, Dauphin is the French term for the crown prince. Specifically, the oldest son. But we're talking about the crown prince. Now, Joan has heard voices from God coming down and telling her, this is your destiny. And through sheer coincidence and natural charisma, she manages to sway the skeptical Captain Robert de Baudricourt, and he gives her soldiers' clothes, armor, and other supplies to assist in getting to the Dauphin. Upon arriving at Charles' court, Joan wins over almost everybody. She's able to pick Charles out of the crowd, which some view as a miracle. Her humility and reverence for the church get the archbishop on her side, and then, of course, there's the Dauphin himself. Takes a little doing, but after a good old-fashioned pep talk, she convinces him to stop messing around and stand up for France and himself. And Charles grants her control of the army. She's then off to Orleans, a town under siege by the English. Joan meets Dunois, the leader of the French troops at Orleans. He has been waiting for a while for the wind to change. It's the only way he can sail his soldiers up the river and launch a sneak attack on the English. Literally, he's waiting for the wind to change. When the wind switches directions upon Joan's arrival, Dunois is convinced that Joan has been sent by God, and they march off together to liberate Orleans. Meanwhile, Joan's enemies are plotting against her. The Earl of Warwick and the Chaplain de Stogumbe, both Englishmen, meet with Peter Cauchon, the Bishop of Boudoir. Warwick wants Cauchon to try Joan for heresy. In other words, she's saying God is, doing all this when in reality, that's just her being a heretic. The angry little chaplain just wants her to die and die painfully. Cauchon agrees to try Joan, but refuses to be a political tool of the English. He says that he will do his best to save her soul. Joan and company have been busy little bees. They liberated Orleans, won a bunch of other battles, and have just crowned Charles as king in Reims Cathedral. Joan, however, isn't satisfied. She's not happy. A good chunk of the country is still not under French control. She encourages Charles. the Archbishop and Dunois to press on and liberate their capital. When they refuse, she says she'll just do it without them. They tell her that if she gets captured, our hands are off. We disavow. She gets captured. She's put on trial for heresy, and sure enough, they disavow her. They don't do anything to rescue her. The bishop, true to the word, does everything he can to try and save her. He's helped in his effort by the Inquisitor, which the Inquisitor is a position that was developed within the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages and then the Renaissance as kind of this investigator. Proves to be impossible, though, because Joan's personal beliefs just don't jibe with the church's. She thinks God's messengers speak directly to her. They think God's voice on earth is the church and the church alone, meaning the voices that she hears must be demons. They also just can't handle her wearing men's clothes. She absolutely refuses to dress like a woman as long as she's a soldier. In the end, they're forced to condemn her to death. Seriously. Because they don't like the fact that she says God is talking to her and she's wearing men's clothes. 25 years later, Charles has a dream in which Joan and a good number of other characters show up to have a chat in his bedroom. And we learn the fate of everybody, and more importantly, we learn of Joan's legacy. King Charles now rules all of France. He sets up a hearing to have her name cleared. We also learn from a time-traveling cleric, keep in mind, this is written by George Bernard Shaw. This is a post-1850 romantic tragedy. So time-traveling character, definitely possible. So, from a time-traveling cleric, that many years afterwards, Joan was made a saint by the Catholic Church. And everybody tells Joan how awesome she is in the dream and how they're sorry that they sold her out. Joan says, great. Now can I come back to Earth as a living person again? Nope, says everyone. And they all make excuses and exit the dream. At the end of the play, Joan's left alone in a pool of light, and she asks God what in the world will be ready, when the world will be ready to accept saints like her. Okay? So, that is, an example of a modern romantic tragedy. Now, bourgeois tragedies. Bourgeois tragedies typically are about middle or lower class characters, not the aristocracy. Often about family issues facing a family or a home. So in the 20th century, we're talking about playwrights such as O'Neill, Miller, and Williams. Tennessee Williams, I mentioned, with Cat in the Hot Tin Roof. That was very much a bourgeois modern tragedy. Eugene O'Neill is who I'm referring to here, and Arthur Miller. Melodramas place an importance on action or effects and musical underscoring. There's a good versus evil. Fears coming to the forefront. Westerns, science fiction, horror, detectives, these are all melodrama. All right, so if I applied this to television series like Law and Order, Criminal Minds, FBI, or the Star Wars films, or the Friday the 13th films. These are all examples of melodrama. So they are modern, melodramatic tragedies. Okay? I know. Probably blowing your mind. You probably never thought that Criminal Minds was a melodrama. It is. Comedies. All right, so now we got to talk about our other genre, comedy. Comedies or plays are usually light in tone, and the whole point of them is to amuse us and to point out the excesses of society and of life and of human behavior. This is a photo from the Broadway play Noises Off. Noises Off is it's a historical play. If you ever get a chance to see it, please do see it. All right, comedies have two specific characteristics: a suspension of natural laws and a comic premise. Now, in lecture number 2, I talked about the suspension of disbelief. Here, we're talking about suspension of natural laws. So, in a comedy, things that shouldn't or couldn't happen do happen. And the comic premise is an accepted premise of concepts can and usually is turned upside down. So, in Noises Off, the idea that a play's last dress rehearsal and the play performance itself should go correctly is turned completely upside down when things fall apart. Now, some techniques of comedy. Verbal humor, for example, making use of puns, or a malapropism. A malapropism is using one word that sounds right, but is quite different. So you have two words that sound similar. One is right, one is incorrect, and you use the incorrect one. So for example, using the word illegible instead of ineligible. That's a malapropism. Comedy characters. Another technique of comedy would be having characters in which there's an opposition between how characters view themselves versus how they actually are. Stock characters. For example, Commedia dell'arte characters. This is a photo of a Zanni troupe, which is comprised of Commedia dell'arte characters, and I'm going to talk about them when we get to our theater history stuff, which will be October, later on, after exam 1. Okay? Or another comedy of character thing would be the concept of exaggerated behaviors, big, over the top. And then a third technique of comedy would be a plot complication. So there could be coincidences. For some reason, coincidences always occur. And coincidences occur a lot in tragedies as well. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Mistaken identities and misunderstandings. Okay, now, I told you previously, I watch a lot of Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and Thai films and television. Their tragedies first of all, it seems like it's the same plot over and over, but they love to use this whole concept of coincidences, mistaken identities, and misunderstandings all the time. They use them to tragic effect. Comedies use them for comedic effect. So this is a plot complication that's in Western theater is used for comedic effect, not really used in Western theater for tragic effect. Okay? So, these plot complications get used in Asian theater for tragic effect, but they get used in Western theater for comedic effect. I know, it's slightly confusing. Keep them separate. All right, so now, types of comedy. Number 1, farce. A farce is exaggerated physical comedy that has low intellectual value. Noises Off is an example of a farce. The Home Alone movies are farce. Okay? Think about it. That's so much physical comedy. Animal House would be farce. Burlesque is crazy, ludicrous imitation of a dramatic form that can be physical, gross exaggerations, and vulgar. I just mentioned that Animal House is farce. Probably better to categorize it as burlesque. The Vacation film series is probably best described as burlesque. It's crazy, ludicrous imitations of dramatic things that involves physical, gross, or vulgar situations and exaggerations. Okay? Now, burlesque has also taken on a term or another idea because of music and dance in terms of certain types of performance in clubs. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about burlesque as a, a genre of comedic theater, like the vacation films, like Animal House. I'm not talking about burlesque in terms of scantily or very little clothed men and women performing certain types of music and dance on stage with feathered fans that you might see in some films, which is a type of burlesque. Okay? Not talking about that. We're talking about an entirely different type here. Satire is the use of irony and exaggeration to mock political constructs. Satire attempts to attack or expose evil and foolishness. In terms of television, Saturday Night Live is a good example. In terms of film, a good example of satire film would be Wag the Dog. Oh, that was a great satirical film. Fabulous film. Before your guys' time. A domestic comedy involves families or neighborhoods in complicated and funny situations. If we're talking about television, The Neighborhood, great example of a domestic comedy. Comedy of manners is a comedy that makes use of verbal, sophisticated societies, making fun of themselves. So that an example of this would be the play The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, probably one of the most well-known comedy of manners plays. And then there's comedy of ideas. These plays are intellectual, they're not physical, they're very verbose, and they tend to look at a clash of ideas. And this would be comedies written by, for example, George Bernard Shaw. He wrote the play Pygmalion. You probably know the musical version of that play, My Fair Lady. The musical is My Fair Lady, both the stage version and the movie, the film, based upon the play Pygmalion, written by George Bernard Shaw, which is a comedy, and the subgenre, the genre of that would be comedy of ideas. Okay? Now, not everything can be defined as being specifically a tragedy or specifically a comedy, fitting into one of their subgenres. Sometimes plays combine elements of both. And as such, these types of plays are often referred to as problem plays. And they're problem plays because they're not just comic and they're not just tragic. A good example is Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. Generally, we divide Shakespeare's plays into tragedies, comedies, and history plays. But the truth of the matter is, some of his plays don't fit into one of those three categories. And because they don't fit, we consider them to be a problem. And so they are a tragicomedy. Now, in a modern era, so since 1850, Anton Chekhov is a Russian playwright who wrote a lot of plays that he thought were comedies. But Konstantin Stanislavski, who directed them, read them, looked at them, looked at him, looked at them, looked at him, and thought he was nuts. Because he said, these aren't comedies, these are tragedies. So while the playwright thought he wrote a comedy, the director thought he wrote a tragedy. And so they had to find a middle ground, the tragicomedy. So when it comes to Chekhov, a lot of his plays would be a problem play. They're tragicomedy. Another type of theater that emerged in the last half of the 20th century is theater of the absurd. And with theater of the absurd, playwrights began to look at the futility of human existence. In other words, the absurdity of life. Theater of the absurd plays typically have a sense of alienation. They are illogical. Things are unjust. And the world that's created in them is ridiculous. The plots generally are very illogical. For example, Eugene Ionesco wrote the play The Bald Soprano. And in The Bald Soprano, one of the stage directions is that we hear a clock strike 17 times. But a character says, "Oh, there, it's 9 o'clock." Now, if you're like me, when you hear a clock strike in a play, I immediately start counting. So you have a character saying, "Oh, it's 9 o'clock," but the stage direction is make sure the sound effect occurs 17 times. That's illogical. The language is often nonsensical, and the characters are very existential in nature, have no real history, no call to action, no reason to do or say anything. Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett is a terrific example of an existential theater of the absurd play. And this photo is from a stage production of Waiting for Godot. So, when we're talking about drama, drama has, in reality, 4 genres. Remember, drama means to do or to act. Tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy, and absurd. Theater of the absurd. Tragedy and comedy comprise the majority of what we're talking about. It goes back to the 5th century BCE. Tragedy can be divided into traditional, pre-1850, and modern, post-1850. Traditional tragedy has generally 2 subgenres, heroic and romantic. Modern tragedy has generally 4 subgenres, heroic, romantic, bourgeois, and melodrama. Comedy has 6 subgenres, farce, burlesque, satire, domestic, comedy of manners, and comedy of ideas. Tragicomedy is neither entirely tragic nor entirely comedic. And theater of the absurd is generally illogical. There's a sense of alienation. It's usually unjust and takes place in a ridiculous world. Okay? And so, with that, we come to the end of another lecture. I realize this lecture is a little bit longer. There was a lot of material to unpack, and I did go on quite a bit about the plots of St. Joan and of Electra, but I wanted to give you those examples. Please make sure you understand all of these terms and the information here as you go to do your discussion prompt related to this lecture, because it's important you apply the concepts and read that prompt carefully. Okay, until next time, take care everyone. I hope all of you have a great day.